Well, good morning. It's so good to be back with you for Bible study again. We are in day 3 here of our Ancient Paths Bible study. My name is Kevin Young. I have the privilege of being the lead clergy for Christ Table. If you'd like to know more about Christ Table, you can visit www.christstable.today. If you'd like to know more about this study, you can go to that URL right there. go.christstable.today/ancient paths. Over the next 6 weeks, we're going to be talking about 6 spiritual disciplines that were important, if not instrumental, in the early years of the church. And so each week we are looking at a different one of the 6. This week we are talking about the liturgy of the hours. If you'd like to download the entire schedule, you can go right there to go.christstable.today ancient paths. You can also, in addition to the schedule, get a PDF copy of this study guide, which has some extra resources and questions for each day in there for you to utilize in your study or in taking others through this study. And if you'd like a physical hard copy of this, you can get a resource box right there at that URL that will give you all of the materials for this study, as well as a few extra things as well that are thrown in there. Today, we find ourselves in the book of Daniel. On day 3 of this study, we are talking about the liturgy of the hours. Now, I know that I mentioned that, but I just want to kind of do a bit of review here before we get into the book of Daniel. So, liturgy of the hours is essentially a way of describing a fixed rhythm of prayer. Some of us maybe have a fixed rhythm of prayer where before a meal we will offer a blessing, or maybe when we wake up in the morning or when we go to bed at night. That is essentially, if you do that regularly, a liturgy. What the church has done for most, or maybe even all of its existence, is to also not just encourage people to have their own fixed, regular, set hours of prayer, but also has encouraged very specific ones as well. We talked about that a little bit yesterday. Now, whenever I say liturgy of the hours or a fixed hour in which to pray, you don't have to pray for an hour. That essentially just means a time, moments of prayer, whether that prayer is an hour long or whether that prayer is 2 or 3 minutes long. So today, again, we find ourselves in Daniel. We're going to be in chapter 6, verses 10 through 14, and we're kind of jumping into the middle of a story here. And we're jumping into the middle of what is the classic story about Daniel, the one that everyone thinks about, Daniel and the lion's den. And so what we're doing is we're going to jump into a bit of the setup for Daniel being sent to the lion's den. Now, Daniel finds himself in captivity in a foreign country. And whenever you read the story, you kind of get the impression that it doesn't really feel like captivity, because Daniel has become a very important person in captivity. And this we kind of see happening. Many of the stories in the Old Testament about the Jewish people whenever they are in captivity tend to focus on the hero stories of those individuals who rose above the circumstances that they were in order to become heroes not only to the Jewish faith, but became heroes to their captors as well. And so this is this classic telling of this story over and over again, where the heroes of the story end up kind of flipping the script in order to prove this idea that Jesus kind of comes along and says that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. In captivity, obviously, those who are captive are the last, but we see that flipping, that upside down idea where the first shall become last. And in many of these stories, those who were first, the captors, end up becoming last. Jesus comes on the scene and begins just to continue to reframe and retell that story, and saying that if you want to be a part of my kingdom, of God's kingdom, you have to understand that this idea that Daniel and Nehemiah and Esther and many of these other huge names of folks who were in captivity but became first by being last, this is a pattern that needs to be repeated in your life as well. And so whenever we think about this idea of prayer and doing so regularly, it kind of forces us into this last place space, if I can put it that way. In prayer, we submit ourselves to a higher power, to a greater authority. And so it puts us into this mindset of being lesser and recognizing that there is one who is greater than us. Daniel is perhaps far and away one of the, if not the best examples anywhere in the Jewish texts or in the Christian New Testament texts of somebody who made prayer their life. Now, that isn't to say that other people did not, but Daniel's story uniquely rotates around this idea of prayer and the trouble that it gets him into for having this liturgy in his life. So with this setup, and I'm just kind of looking at all the folks who are signing on this morning and saying hello and good morning. So it's always good to see we do these live. And so it's always fun to see the feedback. And even if you're watching this by delay, I'll go back and look at the comments and oftentimes try to respond if there are questions and things. So I appreciate that. So why don't we just go ahead and jump into Daniel chapter 6, verse 10. When Daniel learned that the law had been signed, and if you want to do some extra credit study, this law is essentially saying that Daniel is not going to be able to pray. So these folks who were jealous of Daniel, who were natural citizens, not those who had come into the country by captivity, get jealous of him. So they get with the king and they devise this plan to kind of trick the king into creating a catch-22 situation where Daniel is going to be caught in violation of a very important law. And the violation of that law is essentially David's pattern of prayer. So whenever Daniel's pattern of prayer. So whenever Daniel learned that this law has been signed, the text says, he goes home and he kneels down as usual in his upstairs room. And with his window open towards Jerusalem, he prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. So what we see here is very specific insight into what Daniel's practice of prayer was. Whenever we, as we have said over the last few days, see concrete details, those are red flares that point to other things, and we should be paying attention. These aren't just describing Daniel as being a praying man. They're not just here in order to give us color to the story. They are hints or indications that there is something larger, something broader that's going on. So why don't we just kind of walk through this? He kneels down, so he has this posture that he places himself into. Oftentimes, I don't feel like praying, but I have a posture that when I place myself in that posture, my entire mind, body, soul tend to move into that space of prayer. Whenever I get into the posture of being horizontal and laying flat, my body gets into a rhythm of sleep because that's what I'm used to when I'm in that posture. Whenever I'm sitting in the posture that I sit in at my desk, my body and my brain immediately transitions to work. And so if you have a specific posture, a way that you sit, a way that you pray, even though you may not be in the mindset of prayer, putting yourself in that posture moves your body, mind, and soul into a place of being ready for that rhythm of prayer. So he has a posture as usual in his upstairs room. So this is something that Daniel does regularly, that there is a rhythm of this. It's not just that Daniel is a praying individual. It's not just that Daniel prays a lot, but it is that Daniel has a intentional rhythm, usual as normal, regular, with its window open towards Jerusalem. This is a really strong indication that there is a specific religious rite that is going on here. Rite, R-I-T-E, not R-I-G-H-T, not a religious rite, but a religious action, ordinance, R-I-T-E, a religious rite that's happening here. Now, we oftentimes in our Western mindset, often immediately whenever we think of opening windows towards a city in order to pray, we think of Islam and Mecca and the call to prayer. And that is precisely what's going on here. Islam was born out of many of the religious practices of Judaism and Christianity, and many of those have been retained. The ancient ones have been retained in Islam in a way that they have not been retained in Christianity. And so this is precisely what's happening here. Is it is the time, the call time to prayer. And so Daniel, as is his typical practice, has gone to his upstairs room during this time, opened the windows that face towards the city of Jerusalem, and is now in prayer. Everyone's able to see this. Everyone's able to hear this. Daniel isn't putting on a show intentionally, but this is the rhythm. This is the practice. Whether you are living in the Holy Land territory or whether you are in captivity somewhere else, whether you are in diaspora somewhere else. And so windows open towards Jerusalem, and he prays. And if you've seen the previous days of this Bible study, you understand what's going on here, that he prays 3 times a day. And these are specific prayer times, likely sunrise, noon, and sunset. Doesn't tell us that here, but we know from the rhythms of the typical prayers and what we've seen over the last few days in Acts and in Psalm with David, and then now here with Daniel, that there were specific times that they prayed. And so he prayed 3 times a day. Here we go again, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. This was a rhythm that was a part of a specific time of prayer multiple times a day that he'd been doing since he was a kid. He was taught to do this. So it's not just Daniel. This was the practice of the entire Jewish community. Now, we don't know if the other Jews who were in captivity, the other Israelites who were in captivity, were practicing as Daniel is practicing. We don't know if it was an entire community thing, but they just singled out Daniel because of his position of authority. They wanted to bring him down. Or it may well be that Daniel was one of the few or the last people who were practicing this in captivity. We don't know, but that's a possibility. How many times do we have difficulty running through our spiritual practices whenever we are in places where it is not advantageous for us to do so, or where it will be obvious that we are doing so, where we will be seen and perhaps even have to pay some sort of a social price for doing this? We don't know. What we do know is that Daniel, despite the difficulty that he was facing and perhaps even death in continuing on with his spiritual rhythm, Daniel counts his spiritual rhythm as being more important than anything that may come as a result of practicing that rhythm. I don't necessarily want, I think, or need to get into the justification of whether or not it's right or it's wrong to lay down spiritual practices. I know that, I was raised oftentimes with this idea, this verse, if you deny me before man, then I will deny you before God. I'm not discounting that verse, but I'm also very clearly saying that verse is often applied to situations in which it has no business being applied to. Religious people have a tendency to do that, where we will apply verses that have no application to the situation in which we're applying it to, specifically just because we want to control people's actions. So I can't tell you whether or not it is right or wrong for you to lay down whatever spiritual practice you're doing in whatever moment you're doing it, whenever there is risk of exposure, discipline, admonition. That's frankly a decision that you have to make between you and God with the strength and the direction of the Spirit within you. Is there a right or a wrong in there? There is, but I don't think it's for me to judge where the right or the wrong is there. That's between you and God. But I think Daniel offers us a perspective that sometimes, even if the outcomes are knowingly going to be harmful, there are those moments where continuing on in our spiritual practices are more important than what might be gained by hitting pause. And maybe there are moments where hitting pause brings more gain to the kingdom of God than continuing on the spiritual practice. Enough about that. So we see this 3 times a day prayer rhythm that Daniel is submitting to, this liturgy. We spoke about yesterday that the church has continued this idea from Judaism, and even yet today in many monasteries and in very, committed Christians, whether Protestant and especially in Catholic circles, will continue on through these regular hours of prayer that essentially becomes, through the use of time zones and different places around the world, an entire world that ends up praying without ceasing, where every hour somewhere, because of these hours, someone in the world is praying at that time. So let's continue on. Then the officials went together to Daniel's house and found him praying and asking for God's help. They just found him? Yeah, they just found him because he prays at the same time every day with his window open, facing towards Jerusalem. So they go straight to the king and they remind the king about his law, tattletale. My kids deal with this all the time. Did you not sign a law that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except for you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions? Yes. Yes, the king replied, that decision stands. It is an official law of the Medes and the Persians that cannot be revoked, which, I don't know. I'm no scholar on Medes and Persians law and legislation in ancient times, but I don't know. I think he might have been more concerned about what he would pay, what he would sacrifice in looking weak than what he would pay or sacrifice in doing the right thing. But that's just me. So they tell the king, that man Daniel, one of the captives from Judah, is ignoring you and your law. He still prays to God 3 times a day. And hearing this, the king was deeply troubled, and he tried to think of a way to save Daniel. When your captor is fighting on your behalf, you know that your spiritual rhythms are having an effect beyond your life. This is amazing. Well, how did Daniel get into that place? Well, I'll tell you, and this is where we will end for today. I find that discipline yields dividends in all areas. One of the classic examples that I use rather often is the decision that I made to lose some weight, actually a lot of weight, like 95 pounds or something, 5, 6, 7 years ago, and get healthier and spend more time in the gym. And I've talked about how that time in the gym became a sanctuary for me, a place of worship, not of myself, but I find myself praying there. I find myself singing worship hymns there. I find myself crying there. In fact, a lot of the lifts that I do, I realized over the years, there are names and faces attached to those lifts. And so every time I do a deadlift, every time I do an overhead press, I realized I was praying for the same person when I was doing that. And so there are people who are attached to those rhythms. And I realized that it has begun to yield results in other areas of my life, that discipline in one area of my life, that commitment in one area of my life has become a strength, not just physically for me, but also relationally. It's helped build and repair bridges in my life. It's made me mentally healthier, not just physically healthier. It's made me spiritually healthier because I have time set aside every day for centering, um, for praying for people that I didn't have. And so that one discipline yielded a whole lot of positive things in other areas of my life. And it doesn't require being in front of a squat rack in order for that to happen. That can happen and does happen in other areas as well. I could give you other examples, but you probably have examples as well in your past of moments where you were disciplined in something. Maybe it was um, earning a degree. Maybe it was doing the things that it took to um, earn a promotion or getting licensed in something. Maybe it was learning to cook, or taking on a new hobby, or some new routine of exercise, or something that you wanted to learn about and understand more and become an expert at it. And if you reflect back on that, what you probably will realize is if you gave enough time and effort and energy to that and remained disciplined enough to that, I'd probably wager that that discipline alone, no matter what it was given to, allowed you to become more disciplined, more effective, and more focused in other areas of your life as well. And we see this with Daniel. I think because of Daniel's discipline in this fixed hour, this regular liturgy and rhythm of prayer, it paid off. He has literal kings fighting for his good, fighting on his behalf, because he was a person who was honorable, who was disciplined. And that's my hope and my joy for you as well, is that you will consider putting spiritual practices in your life, regular rhythms of spiritual practices in your life, and maybe prayer is the one for you. We're going to talk about 5 more in other weeks, but maybe prayer is the one for you. And when you do so, when you commit to a regular rhythm of your life, especially one that is spiritual, you're going to see that the payoff for that isn't just in the area in which you devoted yourself, but it has tentacles that leaches its way out into areas of your life that are in need, but were disconnected until then. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. Looking forward to being back with you tomorrow for the final day of this week of study on Liturgy of the Hours. And until that time, it's good to be with you. Happy reading.